Hello everyone, welcome to another video, and in this one we are talking about Agentic Workflow Design Pattern routing. So we have discussed about one Agentic Workflow Design Pattern, that was prompt chaining, in the previous video. In this one we will talk about routing. Now this is another design pattern in Agentic Workflow and it is a bit more complex than prompt chaining, and I mentioned earlier in the previous video that this will be a series of agentic workflow design patterns, and for future 3 to 4 videos I'll be talking about multiple different design patterns which you can implement while designing your agentic workflow depending upon the business case. So we discussed about prompt chaining in the previous video. If you haven't checked that out, you can check it out. If you'll click on the playlist, you can get that. This one is on routing. It's one of the design patterns for agentic workflow, and it mentions that if in your workflow you want to handle multiple different things differently, then you can implement the routing design pattern. As in this workflow diagram, it has been shown that we have a router, or basically a router node, which takes an input and it decides which node to call. So you can think of it as a decision maker or a router which basically routes your request to the dedicated node. So if the input suggests that it needs to be sent to this particular node, then the router will gonna forward it to that node. If it is required to send it to the below node here, then the router can direct it to this particular node, and both of these nodes have the capability to return the output. The only idea is that at a particular point of time, the router can route it to either one of the nodes which can perform an LLM call, and then they can return the output. So that is the idea of a router or a routing design pattern. Now if I'll go down, I'll go through the formal definition. It mentions routing classifies an input and directs it to a specialized follow-up task. Now that's what the router is doing here. It basically takes the user input and it tries to understand which node it should be forwarded to, or basically how or where it should be directed to for a specialized follow-up task, right? And this workflow allows for a separation of concerns. So you can think of this as, if you have 3 nodes carrying out 3 different works, then you have actually separated the work or the logic of these 3 different things in those 3 different nodes, and then you can use router to route the request to either of the nodes, right? And then building more specialized prompts. So each of the nodes which are doing some specialized task can have their own specialized prompts. So you don't need to have to do all the things together, or need not to have a single node deciding which things to be done, right? You can have a router which is dedicated to route the request into the specialized nodes depending upon the work which needs to be done, and then this request can be routed. A classic example can be, suppose if you are building a workflow which has 3 nodes, one can maybe return you a joke, and one can maybe return you a poem, and maybe one can return you a story. Then if a user says that, hey, I want to have a story on this topic, then the router should be able to understand that, okay, the user wants a story, I should direct it to the node which is responsible for creating a story, and then the node can answer. Now for creating a story, maybe the user can have some specialized prompts. Maybe they want a story in 100 to 200 words, or maybe 500 words. They want the story to be structured in this particular format. All of these prompts can be encapsulated in that particular node. And that is the whole idea of this design pattern, so that you can encapsulate your entire follow-up task along with the specialized follow-up prompt or the dedicated prompt for that follow-up task into a single node, and that node can execute depending upon the input and the router decision, right? Routing works well for complex tasks where there are distinct categories that are better handled separately. So here in this example, the router is, there are 3 tasks which are being handled separately in their separate nodes, and the router is deciding where to send the user input, or where to direct the control flow of the user input. Now this is the routing design pattern. Now it will get more clear when we're gonna see it live, or we'll actually build it live here in this session. So what we are actually building here is this particular workflow. Now this implements the routing design pattern. How? Let us see. So the workflow starts with the start node, and then after that it will goes to the build model. Now the build model is like we have used this node previously in our previous videos as well for building the workflow. So this will simply create the large language model instance which you can use it. So you don't have to declare the instance multiple times. You can declare the instance in this particular node with the configuration and the model name you want, and this will return you that model, and you will save that model in the shared state which can be used multiple times. So this is one of the workflow which is built in LangGraph, and if you don't know about it, you should watch my previous videos where we have built a lot of different workflows from LangGraph from scratch, and I have explained all of the multiple topics, right? Moving forward, once you have built the model, it will give it to the routing agent. Now the router agent will get two things. First, the large language model which is built by the build model. Along with that, the user input. Now, depending upon the user input, the router agent can route the request to three things. Either it can end the workflow, either it can give it to the summarize GitHub profile, or either it can give it to the summarize medium profile. Now, this, as the note suggests, this workflow is responsible for summarizing your GitHub profile or the medium profile depending upon the request of the user. So if a user is coming up with a request saying that, hey, can you summarize the GitHub profile for this particular user, then the router will understand that, okay, I need to summarize the GitHub profile, so I should route it to this particular node. If a user gives the prompt saying that, can you summarize me the medium profile of this particular user, the router agent will understand that, okay, I need to summarize the medium profile, so it will gonna direct it to this particular node. Once the summarization is done, it will gonna end. Now, currently this workflow supports summarization for GitHub and medium profile. If a user comes up and says, can you summarize the LinkedIn profile of this user, then this is an unsupported operation. In that case, the router agent should be intelligent enough to tell that, okay, this is currently not supported and I should probably direct it to the end node, which will gonna end the workflow. Now this is an example of an workflow which implements the routing design pattern. Now this is the workflow which we are aiming to build from scratch in this session moving forward. So let's do that. Let's build it from scratch and let's understand how you can actually implement the routing design pattern in your agentic workflows. So now we are at the code walkthrough and let's explore this particular notebook. This is the notebook which implements the routing design pattern. I'll quickly collapse the files. So the first thing we'll do is that we're gonna import all the libraries. These are open source, so it shouldn't be a problem. After that, we define the router output. Now this is interesting and important to understand. The router output is the output which is returned by the router node or the routing node. Now we saw in the previous workflow diagram that the routing agent is responsible for routing your particular request to a particular node which will gonna service the request. Now how it gonna understand? It will gonna understand from the query which the user is giving as an input. So it will gonna understand the user query and it will gonna decide where to direct the request to. Now for us in this workflow, the output is a literal, which can be three of these strings. It can be either GitHub, it can be medium, or it can be none. So now in the field, the description says the output destination either GitHub or medium. If neither is suitable, use none. So this is basically telling the large language model that, hey, when you are returning the response, the output should be GitHub or medium depending upon the user query. If a user is asking for summarizing a GitHub profile, return GitHub. If a user is asking for summarizing a medium profile, return medium. And if you think that the request doesn't lie in either of these domain, then return none. All right. User handle. We are also instructing the router to pick the user handle from the user query. So if I ask that, hey, can you summarize the GitHub profile for Saurav, then it will gonna understand that, okay, it has to summarize the GitHub profile. So output should be GitHub and the user handle should be Saurav. So the description is the user's profile handle for the specified output destination. So I can just go ahead and I can define it. After that, we have a shared state. So I have mentioned previously in my videos as well that if you are building a workflow in LangGraph, then every communication between the nodes happens in the shared state. Even if I have to communicate or send some input to the workflow at the time of the start, I need to send it in the form of the shared state, and the final response given by the workflow to the user is also in the form of the shared state. So everything happens via shared state. So we're gonna define it. It will gonna also hold some information which will be needed intermediate at the intermediate point. The query is the query which the user will gonna send. It's a part of the shared state. The user handle is the handle which will gonna picked up by the router node. The destination is also picked up by the router node, defining whether it needs to be sent to GitHub or Medium. Profile summary is a string, basically whatever large language model summarizes the profile. And then the model is chat OpenAI. So we're gonna use the GPT model for now. And to be specific, the details of which model we are using is mentioned here. We are using GPT-4o model. So we declared the build model method. After that, this is important to understand the router agent. This is the agent which is responsible for routing the request, and the prompt is simple. You are an expert social media profile assistant. Based on the user's preference, you will determine whether to pull their GitHub or Medium profile details. Ensure your response is a valid JSON object matching the router output schema. So we are telling the model to return the response in the router output which has been mentioned. Now we are using structured output, and we are ensuring that the model returns the data in the structured format, and the structure is present here in the router output which we have defined above. This is the one. So the model will always return a JSON basically in this format, having an output and a user handle field. After that, once we build the model with the structured output, we're gonna send the prompt. Once the prompt is sent, we're gonna retrieve the response. So the response is returned here. The retrieval grader will be invoked with the user query. Now this will be a part of the prompt template, and we get the response. We assume that the response will always be in a structured router output. So we pick the output and the user handle. So whatever output or the destination the router wants to direct the current flow, we store it here in the destination, and whatever user handle the router is picking up will be stored in the user handle. So once we have this stored in the shared state, we can move the workflow execution ahead, and in future when the future nodes needs a user handle, they can pick it up back from the shared state. So we'll store it here, and the future nodes will gonna pick it back from the shared state for summarizing. Right now I can define it. Now this is one of the nodes in the workflow. What I can actually show you that is I can run this one. It's just the thing is that this is one of the nodes in the workflow, so we'll have to make sure that we run it correctly. So one way we can run it is first we're gonna load the environment variable, and if you will run a workflow, you will run the nodes one by one. The workflow does that internally for you. If you are running the nodes individually, you have to make sure that you run the nodes one by one. So the framework will take care of this thing when we run it through the workflow or through the compiled graph. But now currently we are not running it through the compiled graph. We are running the nodes individually. So what we can do is that we can run the first node, that is build model. We provide the shared state to it. Currently in the shared state, we only need to give the query because that is only we have. That's the only thing we have. And in the query, we have written, can you summarize GitHub profile of Saurav P97? Now, this build model will gonna build the model and we're gonna put that in the shared state as we have shown here, right? After that, we can give this shared state to the router agent, which will gonna pick the model from the shared state and will gonna try to do the operations, and then it will gonna give us the decision. So now we can actually see what is the destination, or basically what is the destination provided by the user along with the user handle. So we can actually see it. So if I run this, it will gonna run and it will gonna provide the details. So again, the destination is GitHub and the user handle is Saurav P97. Now I can change it. I can maybe provide LinkedIn and it will gonna change. The idea is it will gonna give me none because LinkedIn is currently not supported. If I give it a Medium profile, it will gonna try to return Medium because this is how we have configured our routing agent. Currently it supports only GitHub and Medium. That's why it is returning either GitHub or Medium. I hope this is clear. After that, whatever output we got from the router agent, we're gonna send it to the route destination. Now this is a conditional edge because it returns an output depending upon the destination of the shared state. So if the shared state destination is GitHub, we're gonna return summarize GitHub profile. So basically we want to run this node. If the shared state is medium, we want to summarize the medium profile. We want to run this node. If it is none of these, we want to end the node. So, or basically we are returning end node, which will basically direct it to the end node, which will gonna exit the workflow immediately. So I can basically define it. After that, we have two helper functions, which actually does nothing. It basically pulls the details from the URL. So first is read GitHub profile. It takes the user handle as an input, and I think you have guessed it already that the user handle is the one which was picked by the router agent before. So the read GitHub profile takes in the user handle. First it builds the URL. So any GitHub URL is something like that, github.com/user handle. Now, once we have the profile URL of the user, which we want to summarize, we can pull the details from the URL. Now you can do it using the web-based loader. This is one of the libraries provided by LangChain, which allows you to retrieve contents from the URL. So it will gonna return me some documents. I'll gonna get the page content in the string. I'll basically collect all the page content from the document, and I'll gonna make it a single big string containing all the details of the GitHub profile. Similarly, we'll also do the same for the medium profile. The only difference is for the medium profile, we'll have a user handle. To make a medium profile URL, the URL structure is a bit different. So here we use HTTPS, basically userhandle.medium.com. So if my handle is Saurav, then it's saurav.medium.com. While in GitHub, it was github.com/Saurav. So that is the difference which we need to take care of. Apart from that, things are simple. We basically get the profile content and store it in a single page content string, right? Now this is very basic. It will return the details of the URL. It's a helper method. So basically when I say it's a helper method, means it's not a part of the workflow, or basically it's not an individual node in the workflow. It is basically a helper function which is called by one of the nodes in the workflow. I'm gonna define it. After that, we have the first node, or we have, I guess, the third node, which is summarize GitHub profile. Now this summarizes the GitHub profile. How it will do that? Remember, the routing agent returned the user handle as well, and it stored that in the shared state. We're gonna pick that user handle from the shared state and we'll give it to the read GitHub profile. Now we have already discussed read GitHub profile above. It basically gives you the profile content of the GitHub, of the user's GitHub profile. Now this is very unstructured. We want a summarized format of this content. So we'll give it to the large language model and we're gonna tell it to summarize it. Now the dedicated prompt is here in this dedicated node. Now this is what was defined in the definition of the routing design pattern earlier. We have a dedicated pattern, dedicated prompt, which tells us how to summarize a GitHub profile. Now summarize the following GitHub profile content in a concise manner and highlight name, organization, followers, location, contact information, key skills, projects, and contributions. Now these are very specific to a GitHub profile, and that is why this prompt is very specific to summarizing a GitHub profile node. Along with that, I'm also passing the GitHub profile content which we received from the helper function. After that, we provide all of this to the model and we're gonna let them summarize. Once the model summarize it, we're gonna return the data and we're gonna get it in the profile summary. Now the interesting thing is, once the model invokes and it will give us a response, we're gonna get the string, or basically get the summarized profile content from the response of the model, and we're gonna save it in the shared state. Now in the shared state, the profile summary field will gonna store the summary of the profile. Now we can run this. So we have defined this here. In a very similar manner, we do the summarize medium profile. The only difference is we call read medium profile for getting the profile details from the medium user handle. Rest of the thing remains the same. The main difference here is the prompt, because the prompt is dedicated to the dedicated node. Now this prompt will tell the model to summarize the medium profile. So summarize the following medium profile content in a concise manner and highlight name, followers, posted articles, and description. Because medium is basically what do I say, is basically a website which hosts articles, or which lets you post article and host them, and so that people can read it. You have a profile, people can follow you if you're a great author, if they like your articles, and like rest of the things. So these are the details which makes more sense for a Medium profile, and that's why we are providing it in the prompt. Along with that, we are also providing the Medium profile content for the model to summarize. In a similar way, we get the response, the summarized content, and we'll store it in the profile summary. So the interesting thing is both the summarized profile details from GitHub and Medium is stored in the profile summary in the same key. The idea is that it's a routing design pattern, so either one of these nodes can be executed depending upon the router. So if it is a GitHub profile, it will gonna run this and it will store the summary here. If it is a Medium profile, it will run this instead, and again it will store the summary in the profile summary. Okay, after that we can build the graph. So once we build the graph, it will look very similar to the design or the diagram which we show earlier. So the first node is the build model. After starting, it will gonna hit the build model, which will gonna build the model for us, which we can use it later for all the LLM interactions. After that, the router agent will gonna decide where to route the query to, depending upon the user input. Once the router agent decides, it can basically hit the summarize or the Medium profile. So here the workflow edges are arranged. So from the start, it will gonna hit the build model. From build model, it will go to the routing agent. Now the routing agent will gonna give the output, which will be given to the conditional edge we saw earlier. The conditional edge returns the summarize GitHub profile, summarize Medium profile, or end node, depending upon the destination returned by the router agent, right? After that, once we get the output from the conditional edge, we're gonna execute that particular node. If the conditional edge returns summarize GitHub profile, we will execute summarize GitHub profile node. If it executes Medium profile, if it returns Medium profile, we're gonna summarize Medium profile node. If none of them were found, we're gonna basically end the workflow immediately. After that, if the GitHub profile is summarized, after summarization, we'll end the workflow. Same for the Medium as well. And then we can compile this. So let me define this method as well. After that, I can execute. So execution will happen in this way. We're gonna load the environment variables. After that, we're gonna build the graph. So once we build the graph, this method will be executed and we get the compiled graph here. So we can store the compiled graph and then we can invoke the compiled graph with the query we want. So now here we are executing the workflow and all the nodes are a part of the workflow and arranged in that fashion. We don't need to do anything. We just have to invoke the graph with the state and it will take care of the execution of the nodes in the fashion we have arranged that here in the via edges. Okay. Once we get the workflow response, we can see how the response has been handled. So if the destination is not none, we can show what was the destination and what was the profile summary. Okay. Otherwise, we can say that, okay, no suitable profile found. So the input is read the Medium profile for user handle SRVPTK97. Now this is my user handle. So the routing agent should be able to understand that I want to summarize the Medium profile for the user handle SRVPTK97. And then it should route that to the summarize Medium profile node, which will gonna actually summarize the Medium profile for the user handle given. And if I run this one, summarizing the Medium profile, reading the Medium profile content, and after that we're gonna spit out the summarized Medium profile. Now this is how it looks like. Profile type is Medium. This is set by the routing agent. Profile summary is the one which is returned by the summarized Medium profile node. Now this returns the name, this returns my followers, this also returns the articles which I have posted recently on Medium. DP on trace, my Google interview experience, principles of clean coding, a lot of these things. Apart from that, it also returns the description which is present on the profile. Now this is a decent summarized Medium profile for my profile, right? Okay, now this is the Medium profile. Now I can also summarize my GitHub profile. Now let's see how you can do that. So here I'll just gonna say read the GitHub profile for user handle, or basically summarize the GitHub profile for the user handle, and this time I'm gonna give my GitHub profile. So this is my, yeah, I guess this is my correct GitHub user handle. So if the handle is correct, it should be able to summarize the GitHub profile. Now let me run this. Okay, this has been directed to the summarizing GitHub profile content, reading GitHub profile content, and after that, if the handle is correct, it will gonna return the summarized format of my GitHub profile. Okay, so this is how it looks like. Profile type was GitHub, returned by router, and the profile summary is name Saurav Pratik, username Saurav P97, organization Google, previous experience 3 Geeks for Geeks, followers 171, location, contact information, key skills, and projects as well. So these are the projects which is probably present on the featured section of the profile. It was able to pick that. Along with that, it has also picked the contributions. This is a decent summary of my GitHub profile. Now this is this so far so good. The routing agent is working correctly, and looks like the routing design pattern has been implemented correctly as well. Now what will happen if I'll try to let them summarize my LinkedIn profile or any other social media profile which is currently not supported? So we currently support only GitHub and Medium, and if I tell them to maybe summarize the LinkedIn profile for user handle Saurav, the routing agent should not return, or basically should return a none, which will go to the conditional edge, which will send it directly to the end node, and the workflow execution should end without hitting any summarization node. So if I run this one, profile type none, this is what returned by the router, and hence it says no suitable profile found, because the response, the destination is none here. That's why it is going to the else block, and hence it says no suitable profile found. Now this is a very decent workflow which implements the routing design pattern, which routes the request to the dedicated node depending upon the user query, and it is also fault tolerant because it is not accepting the request which is currently not supported by the workflow. So this was it in the routing design pattern. We probably discussed this design pattern in depth. We also walked through building a workflow, which we built it from scratch, which implemented the routing design pattern. We discussed how you can create a router agent that can route your request to the dedicated nodes. Now this was a part of the AI Engineering 101 playlist, and this series is currently the Agentic Design Pattern series, and I guess this was the second design pattern which we discussed in this series. The previous design pattern which we discussed was which we discussed was prompt chaining, and this one is routing. Now I'll gonna come up with more complex design patterns for the future videos as well, so stay tuned. Apart from that, if you found this video insightful, do like it, share it with others, and do subscribe to the channel. And yeah, I'll meet you in the next video.